I just finished this project here, a concrete dragon for my garden. Taking it out there now, but before I do, I want to share with you the process that I use to make this thing. It's actually pretty easy. I was trying to calculate like how much I spent in materials on this to give you some kind of idea, and I came up with approximately 7 cents worth of paint to paint this concrete dragon here. So you'll definitely have to check out that part of the process. But the whole thing is remarkably inexpensive. There's no way I spent $20 on this because most of this was just kind of scrap stuff that I had sitting around the shop here. So there's a lot of ways that you can make fun stuff for your garden. It doesn't have to be tiny little things either. You can make some pretty big, some pretty bold pieces, and they don't have to cost you an arm and a leg. And from a business perspective, if you're the type of person that's looking for cool, fun, interesting things to make and sell, you put yourself into an interesting market with stuff like this, because where would you get something like this from somewhere else? So that's kind of the fun part about making unique items, is that they're one of a kind, and if people are really into it, then you might be able to sell them something. There's hard parts about it as well, like every piece you make is unique, so you can't do any kind of like generic advertising, or you can't sell them in stores, because literally every single thing you make is unique. Such is the life of an artist. I don't make and sell these things, I just make them for the garden, and I also like making them to show you the process, because people don't realize how easy this is and how affordable it is to make stuff like this. I'm confident if people knew about this more readily, they'd be out there making them. And do not look at this and go like, oh, but you're such an artist, I could never make something like this. Bullcrap. I am not such an artist, and you could definitely make stuff like this. Like, I'll give myself a small pat on the back. I'm not the worst artist out there, but I'm no sculptor, that's for sure. I'm just a guy who's really good with technical process, and I love this rock sculpting, or this mortar sculpting process, where you can color and stain it, add texture, do all these fun things, and make these really strong, long-lasting pieces. Again, costs just a couple of dollars to make. I think you should watch this tutorial. It's a really good one. Let's get started. The styrofoam I'm using here, just whatever. I mean, find it wherever you can for as cheap as you can. Used hot tub covers for free, or often people have to pay to get rid of styrofoam. So if you kind of put out the feelers there for, hey, I'm looking to get some, you can probably find it. It's not too hard to find. Okay, and we're just gonna attach some pieces together here. So I'm gonna have to do some cutting of this foam. It's always a big mess. You could use a hot wire or a razor knife or a bunch of different options. I do like a pulse saw. It's one of my preferred methods to approach something like this. But a sharp razor knife works very well also. Just trying to get these two to meet up. So that's the connection I'm going for there. We have to use some hardware to hold this all together. It's not super important that it's aggressively held together, because we're going to have other stages that will help with that. It's more or less like pin it so it stays together while we're working on it. Common nails work fairly well if you can get an angle on them, or long screws as well. So I've pressed some common nails in there, and as you can see, it's already working fairly well. But if you take something like a Red Robertson screwdriver, you can just press those in just a little bit more and get just a little bit better purchase. Like, look how well that's holding in. That's only 2, and you can do that throughout. It's a great way to hold these things together. Doesn't cost you an arm and a leg to do so. So let's keep going here. Actually, kind of like that. Just like that. Let's clean up a little bit before we keep going. What do you say? Why don't I go ahead and change out the batteries before we get started with the next stage, which is going to be the steel application layer. Okay, we are back. Cleaned up a little bit here, but it's a little bit of a continual effort when you're dealing with this styrofoam, that's for sure. So, made an executive decision as I was staring at this guy. I'm going to take down this face. Definitely happy with how this looks. So here's something that I want you to note. The bottom edge, I was very careful to not allow the steel to continue past what would be the bottom edge of this. I don't want steel protruding through such that you could go to lift this up and this lath is very sharp and you would cut yourself. That would be bad. So just take note about how the lath terminates above, about a ½ inch or so above the bottom of the form. All right. I think we're ready for concrete. Let's talk about concrete mix design, or more accurately, mortar mix design, because that's what I'm going to be using here. I'm going to be using approximately 2 parts sand to 1 part Portland cement. That's kind of the magic for what I'm doing here. You could add a number of different things to it in terms of admixtures, like a PVA product or a latex or acrylic product. For example, replace 10% of your liquid component, water, with either a PVA, which is glue, or latex or acrylic. And that will, give you a little bit stronger of a mix. It will have some enhanced resistance to moisture permeation. The PVA, being a sticky product, kind of changes the physical texture of the concrete as you're troweling it, makes it, as I describe, a little bit stickier on the trowel. I might use some of that just because that's useful for what I'm doing here, but realistically, none of that's needed. If you're doing 2 parts sand to 1 part Portland cement, pretty much you're going to be good to go here. When we apply it liberally, but don't go crazy, because we don't want this thing to weigh 700 pounds when it's done. That can be a real problem when you're working with concrete. If you add too much, something like this could end up way too heavy, taking multiple people to move, which is actually okay, it's not the end of the world. But wouldn't it be better if it was, you were very careful with how thick you applied your concrete and you didn't overdo it anywhere in particular, and as a result, it's, heavy, it's not going to blow away in a windstorm, but one person can just pick it up and walk away with it, which is ideal. Speaking of picking it up, let's talk about that. As you can see with the steel that we've added here, it's already really strong. Like, you could pick it up from any single part of it and move the whole thing around, and pretty much it's going to stay like this. And this is all before we add the concrete or the mortar product to this. 2 parts sand to 1 part Portland cement, maybe about 3/8 of an inch thickness as the minimum amount. Not really any maximum per se, but minimum amount. You don't want it to be any thinner than 3/8, maybe even ½ inch ideally, because if you feather too thin anywhere, that area is likely to chip or break off. Let's get started. Let's get started. Let's get started doing the middle of the project that we're doing. It's time to mix our mud for this statue that we're making. We're going to be using a mixed design of 2 parts sand, 1 part cement, and we're going to replace about 10% of the water that we use to mix this together with a PVA product. Now, this is a proprietary brand, Weld Bond. You can use this or any type of PVA, which is thick white glue. And again, up to about 10% of the water, replace that with this liquid product mixed in with the water beforehand, and then that's the water that you use to make your mortar mix of Portland cement and sand. Now, a quick note on both of these, because there's always questions. The sand is the price, or the name that it's called in your area, will change, and it's the same with the cement, so it's kind of hard to just give you the name of it. I can only tell you that this is a relatively fine-grained sand. It's free of bottle caps and larger rocks, things like that. And that's very important because you need to have a consistent sand for making a good sculpting mix with. It is not play sand. That's very important. As play sand looks like the right stuff, but it's tumbled and rounded, and that compromises the strength of the finished product, so not ideal. The type of cement, the name and the number that it's referred to in your area could change. It could be type 1 or type 10. Those are the same thing depending on where you live. It also could be called type N for normal or type GU for general use. So it's the most commonly sold Portland cement product. If you're getting that from the hardware store, you're getting the right stuff. So 2 parts sand, 1 part cement, 10% of the liquid volume, PVA. Let's go mix it up and get started. All right, so here we have the mix. Now, the exact consistency you're going for, it's a little bit of dealer's choice here, right? I like something that's, pretty soft still, because I don't have to work too hard to consolidate it onto the form here, but you can't go too wet. If you go too wet, it's going to be running, and you're going to have the whole bottom edge will kind of fail because the water will pass through, all of your vertical surfaces, and then it's going to accumulate on that bottom edge, and that's not ideal. So you want to find that middle ground. I don't think I have enough to do the whole piece here, but I wasn't really aiming to because, honestly, sometimes it goes really quickly. It's not that big. Boom, put it on, looks great. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you just can't make it, look good, such as art. You stand back, you look at it, you hate it, you take it all off and you start over. If I have a full bucket of mud here, I could be working behind the whole time, especially if it's warm where you're working. It's not particularly warm where I'm working, but this piece could take me an appreciable amount of time, and I don't want to be fighting against time because there's a short amount of time after I've mixed this together where it's the most plastic, the most liquidy, the easiest to flow and stay where you put it. After a while, it starts to stiffen up a little bit. It's still good to use, but you have to work a little bit harder, and it doesn't work quite as well. So I'm going to go with a half bucket here. Probably I'll have to stop at some point and mix up some more. That only takes a couple of minutes, so let's get started here. Tools of the trade. We're going to have a point trowel and a margin trowel. Most of the work is done with the margin trowel. The point trowel gets into the hard to reach places, especially if you're looking at, details and designs and stuff like that. We're going to have a sea sponge. I recommend that you get a package of those. They're not a lot of money from the local hardware store. I have an assortment of texture skins that I've made from polyurethane. You can buy stuff like this online. You can make stuff like this yourself. You've got a couple of options. Or you could just skip this all together and do all of your texturing with a sea sponge and with a little bit of trowel work. It's definitely possible to do well with that. And there's other techniques too, like scrunch up a garbage bag, like a plastic bag, and you can do good interesting textures with that. There's a bunch of different options, but this is what I'm working with today. Yeah, where should I start? I'm gonna start with the head, I think. This whole thing's gonna be awkward just because it's so long. And like it would be easy for me actually right here, but like you can hardly see anything. If I turn it, you can't really see anything, from the other side. So I'm just gonna start right here. I'll try to keep you in mind as I'm, working here so that you can see to the maximum degree what's happening, as much as I'm able to do so. There is no maximum thickness. The minimum, 1/2 inch. You can put it as much as you want, really, for thickness. It only makes it stronger for the most part, but it makes it heavier. I usually try to pay attention to stuff like, there's a hinge here kind of, as opposed to like the flat of the head. And so I'll make sure the concrete's kind of extra thick in that area because I think it would be predisposed to breaking there, somewhere to pick it up and drop it or something like that. I could see a crack developing here more so than a crack here. So I'll make sure to give that, just a little bit extra concrete around there. Same with, these kinds of transition areas where you're transitioning plane. So this mud has stiffened up significantly. I mean, it still totally works, but when I've had it sitting in the bucket for a good, I don't know what that's, 15, 20 minutes, no idea. I find that the moisture sinks to the bottom a little bit. The stuff on the top is a little bit dry. There's an inconsistency between the two layers, and so I'm gonna go respin it. It's important to differentiate between I'm not adding more water and re-wetting a mix which is already hardened. It's still plastic, it's just not optimal. So re-spinning it just for a couple of seconds kind of freshens it up a bit. I guess like throwing the clothes in the dryer for just a minute, right? Spruces them up. So I'm gonna throw this mortar in the dryer for a minute. I'll be right back. Smells like a fresh summer day at a commercial construction site. So it's just a little bit more workable now, and it's getting older, so I need to hurry up and use this up or I'm not going to be able to use it. It takes me a long time to do like the faces and stuff like that. I'm not a terribly great sculpture artist or drawer or anything like that, you know, so I have to kind of, you know, work around my ability. If you have more skill than me, then you probably will be able to have more predictability with your results. For me, sometimes doing a head like this could take 10 minutes or it could take me an hour, or I could end up scrapping the whole project because I just couldn't get it. But you know, this is good enough at this stage. We're going to keep retooling it and reworking it as time passes. But for now, I got to get the rest of the mud on the body here. All out. Got to mix up some more. Okay, I'm happy with that. So we're gonna stop here, let it set up for 24 hours, and then after 24 hours, I will transfer it over to another location where it can sit, not be in my way, for about 1 month's time before I proceed to scraping and painting it. So I will see you back, I guess, in approximately 1 month's time. And here we are back. But it's not the next day or even a little while later. It is months since I've been out here last, and I've been staring at this guy for months now, thinking about painting it. And I've got a pretty good idea what I'm going for here. Essentially, what I'm going to have is a green dragon. And we're going to use an airbrush approach using latex paints that are watered down. And I think that's going to be pretty much the extent of it. A couple of different colors, a couple of different layers, but that's going to be it. So as of right now, nothing's happened to this. It's months old, but it's just been sitting there out in the workshop. So I haven't even broken it free from the base yet. But being that it's been moving around a lot, you know, just moving it from here to there as it gets in the way, it's kind of come free. I can see it's kind of broken free, but the process really is you just kind of move it, that's it. Like, it's broken free. The wood doesn't really grab and hold. So from this stage, all I did was mix and sculpt this mortar, and then I walked away. Now I need to do some scraping and take off, you know, some of the loose debris, little bits that are stuck to it, and then I want to also sand or scrape down the surface and give it a smoother, weathered look. An example, I don't think this stuff will really work, but if you had like a tissue paper, if you wipe that on the concrete, there's a lot of drag, there's a lot of friction here, and you can definitely feel it, and it would just shred that tissue paper. Once you sand this down, it feels totally different. And that tissue paper, in theory, it's not even going to shred apart as you wipe it on here. And that's what we're going for. We want to lose some of that tack, some of that purchase that comes along with a rough, finished, floated, and textured mortar product like this. So how do we do that? I mean, there's a couple of different ways. It kind of depends on what you're working on, the size of it being a big thing. Like, for anything medium to large in terms of this kind of work, a scraping stone like this is my go-to. After a while, they wear down, look something like this. But for this little guy here, I think that's going to be overkill for the job. And for something like this, I would probably just use a 220 grit sandpaper. That's going to give you pretty good results. Other than the 220 grit sandpaper, which I'll kind of apply everywhere, you might find yourself using an assortment of tools like a standard screwdriver or a rasp or a file, even a chisel, something like that. Not really for hammering and chiseling, but more for just using the corners to kind of get down into the cracks and recesses, because that's where you'll see a lot of imperfections. You know, you probably can't see it, you know, from the distance that you're looking at, but there's little bits of crumbs in there, and once you take all that kind of stuff out, sand it down, it looks a lot better, and it's going to give us a lot better of a finished product. Once I paint this, I don't want anything more to be cracking or crumbling off of this, because it's going to reveal the gray mortar finish underneath as opposed to the paint job that we're going to apply. So that's pretty much it. I'm going to scrape the whole thing down, sand the whole thing down. I'll be wearing my mask while I'm doing so, because you don't want to be breathing all that in. Spin it around a couple of times, make sure we get it all, and once we get to that point, all we have to do is clean it down, and then we're ready to paint it. I guess let's just get started here. You could hit this thing with a compressor and get rid of all that dust, but it's going to make one heck of a mess. Best bet, take it outside, get the garden hose on it, blast it off a couple of times, maybe even use a soft bristle broom or of some kind just to kind of get in all the nooks and crannies and really work all that dust out. You don't want any dust left on this before we begin the next step, which is the painting process. We are back and we are ready to paint. If you went the method of using a hose to wash off all of the dust off of the piece that you're going to be painting, you have to let it dry thoroughly, not just like superficially dry. The drier, the better. Wait 2 days, wait a week if you have to. It's not worth it trying to paint it when the concrete's damp. Like, you can do it. You can get the job done. It looks okay usually. More often than not, you're gonna introduce some sort of cosmetic fault. The paint won't really adhere in the same way. You want the concrete to be dry and thirsty and readily absorb the water and the paint that you're going to be applying. If you apply that to something that's relatively saturated already, that's not the best conditions for using a water-based paint and painting concrete. It's kind of like a surprising, twist to how it normally goes. Normally for paint applications and for concrete applications, both of those, you would want the substrate to be dry before you're applying your paint layer. Not in this case. This case, it works best if the piece that you're painting is bone dry. So let's get started. The first color that I'm going to be working with is yellow. This is just acrylic or latex. I mean, it's pretty much the same thing. I'm pretty sure that latex is just the, naturally occurring version of what acrylic is the man-made version of. Either one is suitable for use in this application because we just need to thin it with some water. These are water-based. We're going to thin it with some water. That's all we got to do. How thin? 3 to 1, 4 to 1, something like that. We want it to be fairly thin such that the airbrush or spray or whatever mechanism that you're using for painting isn't choking on how thick the paint is. You need it to be thin enough to apply, and that's pretty much all that we're going for here. So I'm going to get started. We're going to go with yellow as the first color I'm going to start with. I'm going to be using an airbrush for this process, and I'm going to start by thinning out some of this yellow. Painting days always make such a big mess, so I'm just ready for that. Not much at all, really. Just a couple of globs. Pretty darn yellow. All right, we're in business. Okay, before I apply that paint, I just want to tape off a couple of areas here to give myself a starting point to work with. Let's see how these tapes work. far, so good. Can you see that? I hope you can see that, because it would be a lot easier on me if I could just keep going here. But if you can't see it, I mean, what's the point of even making a YouTube video? I would have to wonder. Okay, fine, I'll move it. Lost the battery, but I've got you back now, so let's keep going. And we're back a few days later. Paint is entirely dry, which is what we need before we can apply the sealer layer. Let's talk about concrete sealer for a second here. The world of concrete sealers is very deep. It's a phrase I repeat all the time, but it's true because there's so many different kinds for different applications and all sorts of stuff depending on what you're doing. But I'm just going to give you like a cheat code here. We used acrylic paint, and it was a water-based paint. So let's use an acrylic sealer, which is water-based. If you've got that, we're not going to have any compatibility issues here. There's many kinds of different, even to this extent, acrylic concrete water-based sealers. There's so much build on the surface, kind of like a shellac coat that's a 32nd of an inch or just like maybe a millimeter thick on the outside, and it provides somewhat of an abrasion resistance. But in my experience, that product yellows in the sun over time. And I prefer an acrylic water-based sealer which permeates the concrete itself and helps to provide resistance to water permeation in the future, which is what helps to create this color fast effect in the concrete. Concrete is essentially like a sponge, and that's why our paint was successful here. We painted some on there along with some water to carry it along, and the concrete just drank that right up because it was so thirsty. Now it's permanently in there. It's not even on the surface level. You could scratch it and you're still going to have a little bit of that color showing through underneath because it's very, very thin, but it is below the surface here. With an acrylic water-based sealer that does the same thing. You spray it on. This stuff in particular, it has a purple hue to it. In the bottle when you shake it, and also when you apply it to the product here, you'll notice it kind of looks purple. That totally goes away. It dries clear. It stays clear over time. It doesn't yellow in the sun. That's why I use this stuff. The brand that I'm using, that's not really important to you because it's probably not available where you live. What you need to look for is a water-based acrylic concrete sealer. And ideally, you're going to see something that when you apply it on, it absorbs into the surface. That's what I'm looking for. And these are the examples that I'm using here. These are ones that are locally available to me. Big box hardware stores carry these. They're both really the same thing. One is just a matte finish and one is a gloss finish. If we're being honest here, they're both pretty glossy when they're finished. If there's a complaint about this process, it's that it makes stone or artificial rock look too fake because it's kind of shiny, and real rocks are never really shiny in nature. So even the matte one has a little bit of a shine to it. So be aware of that. Depending on what a finished effect you're going for, you might find even the matte one is a little bit too shiny, but over time that does wear off. Now, in theory, if you're going for optimal color fast retention for the longest period of time, you have to reapply your sealer every year. It's just how it works. I've done that, but I've also done the other end of the spectrum here where I apply it one time and then I never touch it again. And eventually it will fail. Like I think the oldest ones that I have now are maybe 14 years old, and we're talking weathering outside in Ontario, Canada. So freeze and thaw conditions, like frigid winters, like all kinds of harsh conditions for a paint job on some concrete. And they all look pretty good. Now, the benefit here is when you're making something that looks like this, as it scratches and wears and weathers, that kind of just looks natural anyway. It doesn't really detract too much from it. But if I want the best color fastness possible that I can achieve for this thing that I've made, whatever it is you're making, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply 2 light coats of this acrylic water-based sealer, and then once every year, I'm going to take the piece out of the garden, rinse it off with a garden hose, make sure it's good and clean, let it dry 100% thoroughly, and then I would apply another, you could do another 2 layers, but even just one more layer at that point really would do it. If you're applying it every year, you do the 2 coats the first time you do it, and then subsequent years, it's just 1 coat of acrylic sealer. If you do that pretty much short of, somebody's kid taking a hammer and just whacking the heck out of it, your color fastness is pretty much going to last indefinitely. So enough talking, let's get going. We're going to apply this right now. I'm just going to put on some gear so I don't have to breathe that. You can use a brush or a roller, lots of different stuff. I find a sprayer is pretty good. Get started. With this product, you want to go lighter rather than heavier. You do not want to have it running down if you can avoid that. Now we have to wait for that layer to dry before we can add the next layer on. Here we are back about 1 hour later. It's very important that you read and follow the instructions on the concrete sealer product that you're using. The one that I'm using says leave at least 1 hour in between coats, so that's what I've done here. One more light coat and then we're done. Let this dry for at least 24 hours before you let this be exposed to moisture, rain, anything like that. That's it. We're done. He's ready for the garden. I'm going to go put him outside now. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I'm making the tutorials longer and more in depth now because I really want you to see all the steps of the process involved. And there's a lot going on to arrive you at something like this, but once you've seen it done once or twice, you realize there's not really a lot of mystery here, and there's a lot of fun stuff that you could make. There's not really a lot of limitations when you're working with concrete or mortar. That's why it's the #1 most used construction material on the planet. That's why it's a great idea to learn how to work with concrete as a hobby. And that's why you should like this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. All right, buddy, let's go. Come.